Now let's make sure we render some actual real bars. For the moment, with some dummy data, but later connected to the actual data the user is able to select inside of Power BI. Now for that we'll have to change quite a lot. I'll remove this dummy rectangle we set up earlier. I'll leave the SVG though, because we're still going to use SVG to render our bars. SVG is a very flexible system for rendering charts in the end. And it's not Power BI exclusive, it's a default technology, also available in the web, which is why we can use it here. And I first of all want to set up one additional element here in my constructor, which I'll also store in a new private property. And I'll name it bar container. And as the name implies, this will in the end be the container that will contain the bars of, well, the bar chart. This will be another selection in the end, and it will also hold an SVG element. And as before, we can set all the other generic types, as they're called, to any. And then here in the constructor, we set this bar container equal to this SVG, selecting the SVG we created. And then we append a new element there, which is a G element. G is also a default element you can use in SVG, and it stands for group. And I'm using this because it will group together my different bars, which I'm going to render later. Now that's it for the constructor for the moment. And therefore we'll continue an update, which we learned also runs right at the start. There, I now want to render multiple bars in the bar chart. And for that, we'll need some data to know how many we need. And later, that data will come from Power BI. For the moment, I will work with some hard-coded data here. And therefore, outside of the class, I'm going to add a new const, which is a data container in the end. And I'll name it dummy data, because it really just is that. And that is a so-called array. With these squared brackets opening and closing, you are creating an array, which is basically a list of data. And in there, I want to have multiple so-called objects, which you create with curly braces. I also mentioned that classes can be used to create objects. Classes are blueprints for object, and then you have to instantiate them, which in our case is done by Power BI service with our class. This is an object we create on the fly without creating such a blueprint first. And especially for simpler data, that is perfectly fine. Now in my object, I want to have a value property, and then we add a colon, and now here, inside of an object, not to assign a type, but to assign the actual value that should be stored in this property, in this key, so to say. And I'll set this to a value 10, which is just a number, 10. And then here, another property, which I'll name category. And those names are up to you, but to follow along smoothly, I recommend that you use the same ones. And I'll set this to a text and name it China, because let's say we are having some sales data here, like in the dummy data I shared earlier with you in the module. So then I'm going to copy that and also add some data here for the USA, and add more data, like 11 here for India, and then another piece of data for Germany. Let's say that is 5. So now we got this dummy data. Again, later this will be replaced with actual data, but for the moment it's good like this. And now back in Update, we can work with that and we can output it in our bar chart by rendering elements. For this, I reach out to my bar container property, so to the property we initialize here in the constructor. And on that, I will call select all. Now we saw select before. Select all is basically a variation. Select all, unlike select, does not just select one element, but multiple elements. Now, of course, the bar container is a group which currently has no elements at all, because we just appended the group and nothing to the group. But here, we'll be using a special pattern that is quite common in D3.js, where we select all elements in another element. And if those elements don't exist yet, D3.js will be able to tell us that they don't exist yet and will make it very easy for us to create them on the fly, or to update or remove them if we, for example, had too many elements based on the data we're going to connect. And to learn more about D3.js, if you are interested, and if you know a bit of programming, attached you find a mini YouTube series we created where you can get a more thorough start to D3.js. So for the moment, we're just going to call select all here. And now here, I'll select by passing in a string that basically describes what I want to select. And here I could select a SVG to select all SVG elements inside of G, so inside of the group. Or I use something which is called a class selector, a CSS class selector. For that, you type a dot and then the class name. Now, if you never heard about CSS in HTML, this won't tell you much, but in HTML, you can add so-called CSS classes to elements to basically tell CSS, the styling language you can use in the web, which elements should receive which styles. And for that, you can use a concept called CSS classes. Now, with this special syntax, with the dot and then the class name, we select all elements in the bar container that have a CSS class of bar. Now, as I said, at the beginning, we won't have any such elements, but that's going to change. Because now we're going to do something which is called join data. And that's a div-free object. For that, we call the data command on the selected bars. And to data, we pass the data we want to join. In our case, the dummy data. So here we point at this dummy data array we created above. This array here. Now, this connects this data to the selected bars, and div-free.js will be able to look into the data and, for example, see how many elements we have in that array. And it will be able to see how many bars, so how many elements with a bar class we have rendered here. And it will then be able to tell us if we should render more to have 1 bar per data point, or if we maybe have too many bars because the data only has 3 data points and previously we rendered 4 bars. That's that data-driven document manipulation I mentioned earlier. So here, div-free.js will be able to figure out that initially we have no bars rendered, no elements with a bar class, and that data has 4 elements here. So therefore, we might want to render 4 new elements. Now, first of all, I'm going to store this in an intermediate variable though, again with const, and then I'll name this bars. So again, that's some data storage, which unlike a property is not available in the entire class, but just in this method. That's the difference between using this and storing something in a property and using const inside of a method. And I'm also going to restructure this to make it more readable. And now with that, we can use our bars here. So the selected bars with the joined data, and call enter on it. Another command exposed by div-free.js. Now enter basically will give us that information div-free.js derived on how many bars might be missing based on the data. So how many bars should enter the screen, so to say. So this will give us the information about what might be added or what could be added to have an equal amount of elements as we have data points. And now it's up to us to do the addition. And for that we call append on the result of enter, and now append 1 new element per data point div-free.js identified to be missing in the currently rendered content. And here I want to create 1 new rectangle per data point. That is how you can read this code. Now, one important thing is that now to this rectangle, we should add the bar class to make sure that this select all selection here is able to find those rendered elements in future updates so that it correctly sees how many bars we have at all time. And to add such a class, we call class here on the added rectangle. And then as a first argument, we pass in the class name, for example, bar in this case, and as a second argument, simply true, which means we want to add it. And this will add a bar CSS class to every rendered rectangle. Now we also, of course, should give our bars some width and height. So I'm going to call attr and set a width of, let's say, 50 and set a height of, let's say, 100. And again, I'm going to restructure this across multiple lines to make this a bit easier to read here, just like this. If we save that and we reload, we should see 1 black block here. Now, of course, we might have expected more than just 1 block because after all, we have more than 1 data point. Well, the reason for this is that currently they're all stacked on top of each other. We can, however, control the position along the x-axis, for example, by setting x, and then maybe set this depending on which data point it is. Doing this manually, however, will not be a lot of fun. Figuring out where which bar belongs, that's not a lot of fun. In addition, the width and especially the height should also not be hard-coded here. It should depend on our data point. For example, China should have a bar that is taller than the bar of the US or of Germany. So therefore we need some help in figuring out the correct height and width and x and y position. And that's also something where D3.js can help us.